September 8th, People's Climate Movement, which is the conglomerate, or not conglomerate, coalition that sponsored the big climate marches in Washington and New York City, they're sponsoring a day of action on September 8th across the country and the world. And that's the theme, Rise for Climate, Jobs, and Justice. And so here in Columbia, instead of doing a rally or a march, we're holding a seminar to really educate people on what the impacts will be for jobs and also justice considerations of climate change, and then just give an update on the climate, some of the latest news about that. So that'll be on September 8th. And then on September 26th will be the next in this seminar series about climate action, and that's already set up and planned. It's going to be September 26th. It is at the Boone County Commission Chambers. I know we keep bouncing you around all over town if you've been coming to these, but we go where the free room is available. And that topic is going to be eliminating or reducing food waste, which is a major problem in this country and around the world. And it really help us be able to adapt to climate change if we could do that better. And then I'll talk about the Como Public Workshop later in my presentation, but that'll be coming up in November. And I did want to mention for anybody that knows anyone in the Jefferson City area that the presentation I'm giving tonight, I'll basically be doing a repeat of it without the Columbia specifics in Jefferson City in November. So that's the other one that's mentioned up there. Okay, so tonight's topic, and then the other thing I wanted to mention before I forget, I have put together, I have a blog on the internet. It's called Slowing Climate Change, and it's one of the things that oftentimes when you go to a presentation like this, you feel like you want to take individual action when you leave. And so this is a summary of 78 or more individual actions that you can take to help fight climate change. So I'd encourage you to pick this up, or maybe put the link in your smartphone, and then you would have access to this, and you would be able to work the list. I haven't even accomplished everything on the list yet, but it's important that we get started trying to make these kind of changes in our life, and see more about that as we get into the presentation. Okay, so tonight's presentation, let me start on the timer. Tonight's presentation is about the climate change impacts on public health and security. As I said, my name is Carolyn Amparan, and I'm a climate reality leader. And what that means is that I'm a member of Al Gore's organization called the Climate Reality Project, a volunteer member. And Al Gore, several years ago, started training people around the world to be able to deliver his slide set to help educate people about the climate crisis. Not just about why we have climate change, but about the impacts of climate change, and then also, even more importantly, the solutions of climate change. And he's now trained over 14,000 people around the world, and we have 2 people here in Columbia that have been trained, and actually there's 2 more getting trained this week. So if you have any groups that would be interested in a presentation on some aspect of climate change, there are people available, and I've got some little green sheets in the back that have information on different topics that you might be interested in. This is a subset of his slides that focuses, of course, on the health and security aspects. So, as I mentioned, this is the Climate Reality Project. Most of the slides that you see tonight are from his slide deck. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I'm also a member of the Mayor's Task Force in Columbia to develop the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. So I'll give you a brief update at the end of the presentation on where we stand on that and how you can get involved. And I'm also one of the local leaders for Sierra Club, and so there's a lot of information on the back table about Sierra Club, and they're one of the sponsors for tonight. So to jump into this, so I said that we would talk about health and security, but you have to ask yourself, well, what do we mean by security? A lot of times in the news, it gets thrown around that what we mean by security is national security, which might be the absence of war or the presence of war. It might mean the absence of invaders or terrorism. It might mean lack of crime. But it can also mean other things that are important to us here in the United States today, like having enough food, having enough clean water, having air conditioning if we're having a heat wave like we've been having this week, having refrigeration to make sure that your food doesn't spoil, or if you have medicines that you need to keep cold, having a home that hasn't been flooded or destroyed, having medical care available when you need it, and having a job. All those can be aspects of security, and all of those areas can be impacted in some way by what's happening with our changing climate and the climate crisis. So climate change is considered a medical emergency. This came out of a Lancet Commission, which is a European body, in 2015. And the reason they said this is because climate change, in terms of its potential impact on public health, is so significant, it has the potential to reverse the last 50 years of gains that we've made in health. And when you think about the past 50 years, there's been a tremendous amount of progress in terms of global health. Expectations for how long we're going to live have changed. Diseases have been eradicated. New vaccines have been developed. They've found cures for a lot of things, or at least ways to help people with cancer live a lot longer. So there's been all kinds of progress in the last 50 years. So when these people who are health professionals say that it could potentially wipe out the last 50 years of progress, that's fairly significant and something that we need to pay attention to. So I'm really glad that you guys are here tonight to help inform yourselves so that you will be prepared. And I changed my presentation a little bit tonight to include more of preparation as opposed to just talking about what the impacts are. So, just to give you some food for thought about ways that we as individuals can take charge. Now, we might think, a lot of what you hear about in the news is the impacts of climate change on third world countries, less developed countries, and we think, oh, I'm an American, I have this great lifestyle, it's not going to impact me. But it is. The situation is that every American is vulnerable to the health impacts of climate change, and there's a couple reasons for that. The first one is that climate change can make existing conditions worse, or existing risk worse. So it can make heat waves worse, it can make storms worse, it can make flooding worse. Those are all things that we have in our environment today, but climate change can make them worse. The second way it will impact every American is climate change will introduce new risk where they haven't existed before. So for example, Zika virus. It did not exist previously in the Western Hemisphere. Now it does, and that is something that the mosquito has found a nice place to live here because of changes in climate, and its range will continue to expand as the climate warms. So that's an example of how you can have a new risk developed where one didn't previously exist. So, who are the most vulnerable people to climate change impacts? Now, I said all of us will experience it in some way, but certain populations are more vulnerable than others. And so it's important for us to be aware of these populations so that as a community, we can make sure that we're watching out for these people. If you have people in your family, then you can make sure that you're thinking about the extra situation for them as it relates to these health impacts. And this is something that, as I work with my colleagues on the Climate Action Task Force, we're really trying to keep this in mind as we consider the actions that we'll be taking in the community. So the most at-risk populations include, and it's kind of a long list, children, pregnant women, older adults. Unfortunately, as we get older, a lot of our systems are not the same as they used to be. Just as like with a baby, their systems haven't developed. As we get older, some of our systems don't perform at the same level that they did when we were younger. People with chronic medical conditions, and we'll talk more about why as we go through this. Low-income people, because they just don't have the resources to adapt to climate change. They don't have the resources necessarily to make their home more energy efficient. They don't have the resources to be able to travel away from a situation if there's a bad situation where they're living. Also, communities of color, part of that is because they're traditionally, historically have been more of the low income. Indigenous people, again, lack of resources. Women, one of the reasons women are on the list is because the majority of people that live in poverty are women, and again, lack of resources. and then non-English speakers, because the people that are in this country that don't speak English have a harder time understanding information given to them about risk and threats or potential programs to help them deal with that situation. And this is just a quote from Pope Francis regarding, just to really emphasize that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. And whether this is because somebody puts a chemical plant in their neighborhood or whether it's because of climate change, we frequently find that poor people are often subject to these threats on the environment. Oftentimes they just don't have the resources to be able to fight whatever is being done to their community. So how does climate change affect our health? It affects our health in a lot of different ways, and we'll talk about each one of these briefly tonight. And the other interesting thing about all of these is that they're all interconnected with each other. So not one of these factors works in isolation. They all somehow will work together and affect one another. So the first thing we'll talk about is extreme weather events. And I know that you're all very familiar, of course, if you watch any news at all, you're very familiar with the fact that we're having more extreme weather. But we do want to talk a little bit about it tonight in the context of public health. So worldwide, extreme weather catastrophes have increased significantly over the last several decades. This is a statement, and this comes from insurance people. So this isn't any kind of, like liberal agenda putting this together. These come from insurance people who are the ones that generally have to pay for this type of catastrophe. And so these are worldwide extreme weather catastrophes, and you can see that they've all increased since the 80s. And really in the 2000s is when the heat effect really started to be very noticeable, that our climate was changing. We started experiencing the heat, at least here in the United States. And so you can see that, it looks to me just, proportionally that floods and mudslides have increased the most, but they've all increased, and we know, for example, that, wildfires have increased a lot this past summer in California and even up into the Arctic Circle. And then, of course, there's also an increase in storms. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to mention on that is one of the things is that people don't realize is they often, I come from a middle-class environment where I can afford insurance, but a lot of things are uninsured. So of these weather catastrophes, if we talk about just 2015 specifically, there was $103 billion in U.S. dollars of damage related to these catastrophes in 2015. Of that, only $32 billion was insured. So $100 billion of damage, only $32 billion insured. And so that's something that as a community we have to think about, because the cost of not taking action on climate change is very high. And you might hear frequently politicians say, well, the cost to take action is too expensive. Well, the cost to not to take action is equally or more so expensive. And so that's something that when we're talking to our elected officials, it's something that's important to keep in mind. So another thing that you sometimes hear on the weather, they do talk about climate change more on the weather on television now, which is great. But oftentimes what they'll say was, well, we don't really know the impact of climate change on this particular storm. Or for a while they were saying you can't attribute this particular storm to climate change. Now certain storms they do attribute to them, like Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Harvey. Those storms were made much worse by climate change, and that's been acknowledged. But the important thing to realize is that the environment in which all storms now form has been changed because the climate has changed. And the reason we call it climate change now instead of global warming is because it's not equal warming across the entire world. Some parts of the world actually are a little bit cooler for various reasons. But most of the world, and on average, the world is getting warmer. So after a while, the scientists started saying, well, maybe we should call it climate change instead of global warming, because really it's not affecting everything equally. So one of these things, one of these situations or these changes in the environment that has caused an impact on all storms, and this is just a scientific fact, warmer air holds a lot more water vapor. So this is something you can learn in science class. And with each additional 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase, and the world has already warmed 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase on average, so with each 1 degree that the world warms, the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor increases by 7%. And because of that, there's already 4% more water vapor over the oceans than there was 30 years ago. So that's what they mean when they say that the environment in which any storm forms now is different than it was 30 years ago. So as a result of this being more water vapor in the air, the downpours that we're experiencing are getting bigger. So instead of having frequent, small, light, gentle rains, we'll probably go more periods where we have dry conditions like we've been having, then we'll have a downpour and a lot of rain in a short period of time. And then we'll go back to dry conditions, then we'll have a downpour with a lot of rain in a short period of time. So that's what we mean by the downpours getting bigger. And so heavy downpours are increasing. This visual shows you, and I'm hoping everybody can see and I'm not blocking this. This visual shows you the change from 1958 to 2012. And you can see in the Midwest that we've already experienced a 37% increase in these heavy rain events. So this is not something for the future, this is something that's happening today. And it's definitely something that we're looking at in terms of the Climate Action Plan for Columbia, in terms of the built environment and how we manage stormwater in the city. And Columbia already does a great job of that, but it's something that we need to make sure that these projections are being factored into. Now, in Missouri, we had one of these heavy downpours in 2017. I don't know if you guys remember, some of you who are real involved in the climate movement will remember we were trying to hold a rally outside that day. And there was this heavy, heavy downpour, and so we had to move inside. But parts of Missouri experienced what we call a 1 in 1,000 year rainfall event between April 28th and May 4th. This is a picture from Fenton, Missouri of the flooding. And so what happened was, during a 48-hour period, parts of Missouri got over 10 inches of rain. And so you can see there on the slide, the dark red parts are the parts that got the most rainfall. So this is not something that's happening other places. This is something that's already happening in Missouri today. And unfortunately, there have already been 15 1 in 1,000 year downpour events in the U.S. since May of 2010. And we shouldn't even have had, 2, but we've had 15. And so let me talk for a second about what that terminology means. So you often, when you buy a home, you talk about whether you need flood insurance for that home, and they often look at, are you in the 100-year floodplain? And that means that there's a possibility of a flood. They call it the 1 in 100-year event. But what that really means is that there's a 1% chance in any given year that it might flood. A 1% chance in any given year is really what a 1 in 100-year event means. If it's a 1 in 1,000 year event, that means there's a 0.1% chance in any given year that you'll have that kind of a flood. So to have 15 of those floods in 8 years in the United States was really significant. And for Houston, they've had like 3 in 2 years. So they're not doing well at all. So I wanted to talk about what some of the health impacts are of floods. We all know, of course, there's the risk of dying, the turn around, don't drown if you drive into rushing water. So don't do that. But there's also other health impacts of floods. So it's important to know that children are particularly vulnerable to all these flood health impacts because their immune systems are still developing. Really, a lot of the things we'll talk about tonight, the reason children are more vulnerable is because their immune systems aren't fully developed yet. So frequently with flooding, you get contaminated water. Water goes where it was never meant to go, and so it picks up chemicals, it picks up sewage waste, it picks up manure, it picks up fertilizer from fields, and so you get all this stuff in the water. And so that's one problem. Frequently in floods, the wastewater treatment centers can get overrun, and so that's another problem when you have these major unexpected floods that are these more significant events that may not have been planned. in 1993, when there was the big flood near Columbia, you know, the wastewater, or the wastewater, was it drinking water, Jay, or wastewater? Drinking water. Drinking water almost got overrun, but, you know, Jay and his team kicked into action and were able to stop that. So it's important that, you know, when we're looking at our city infrastructure, that we think about, are our facilities prepared for these kind of 1 in 500 year and 1 in 1,000 year events? And, you know, this is one of the problems that they had in Harvey, is lots of wastewater systems and drinking water systems got overrun. And another problem can be that we lose refrigeration because we lose power. And this means that people will be like trying to eat the food up that was in their refrigerator, and they'll get exposed to more foodborne illnesses. And they also may have problems with medication that needs to be refrigerated as well. So what do you need to do to prepare for a flood? Well, first thing to do is know your flood risk. So, and I tried to arrange tonight to be a session about stormwater and flooding in Columbia. We weren't able to pull that together for tonight, but come back in October for the next seminar in October, and that's going to be the topic at that time. So we'll have more on flooding then. But I will say that I have looked at the maps, and for the most part, Columbia has done a really good job of keeping buildings out of the floodplain. They're definitely out of the 100-year floodplain, but we do have a few that are in the 500-year floodplain. And so one of the things that Kim Wade, who's also here, is on one of the committees with me, and we've talked about, you know, maybe one of the actions we should take as a city is to make sure that every property owner that has a building in the 500-year floodplain is aware of that. And, you know, that they maybe would like to think about buying flood insurance if they don't already have it. You should always have an emergency kit. I'm a pet owner, so I always like to remind people to include food for their pets as well. And this applies to any emergency, but, you know, floods are a greater risk now. Store extra drinking water. And being an environmentalist, I don't recommend those single-use bottles. I recommend you get, you know, the large, like 5 or 10 gallon size, and store a bunch of drinking water for your family. Do not allow children or pets to play in the flood water. That's because, as I said earlier, the flood water is contaminated. It can carry all kinds of diseases, which we'll talk more about later. So you don't want to be letting them play in the flood water. Sometimes after floods, I see these videos people think are cute of their dog playing in the flood water, and I'm just like, no. If you have to leave, try and take your pets with you. Don't leave them behind, because then you know, that just increases your anxiety. Take your medications with you, and do not drive into floodwaters, as I said earlier. So you can find more tips on the web, but it's definitely something to be aware of. Another change that is happening, and this is, I said earlier, we've already experienced on average 1 degree C of global warming across the world. So this is one of those things that's already happening. And then this research report found that lightning strikes increase by 10 to 12% for every 1 degree C of warming that we have. So this is something that's already happening. Expect more lightning strikes. Be sure to take precautions when there's a lightning storm, and expect that this is going to continue to get worse over the next several decades as our planet continues to get warmer. So next up, we're going to talk about, there's 3 global systems that are vulnerable to changes in our climate. And these disruptions can lead to both political and social instability. And so we're going to talk about that specifically as it relates to us as individuals and as a community. The first one that we're going to talk about is the food supply. So most of you probably learned in school that the United States is the breadbasket of the world. That's frequently, I think, the terminology that gets used. And so you can see here on this slide that North America, South America, Australia, and sometimes Russia are net exporters of food to the rest of the world. All the rest of the world is normally in what's called a food deficit, and that they don't have enough food to feed their population. And this is from a time period, a long time period, from 1965 to 2012. So the rest of the world is very dependent upon a few parts of the world to provide them enough food. And so this has a lot of implications for, you know, what happens if we have, you know, a changing climate And most of our agricultural crops were developed over the last 10,000 years when the climate was stable. And so, although scientists are rapidly working to try and get agricultural crops that are adapted to these changing climates, it's not something that, is immediately, present as to exactly how that's going to happen. So, climate change affects food supply in a lot of different ways. And just like with all those health factors we saw earlier, all these factors that affect food are interrelated with each other. So we'll talk about several of these, but just for the sake of time, we won't talk about all of them, but I am going to focus on the ones that are most important for Missouri. So nutrition. Interestingly, and this actually is not a climate change impact in the sense that this relates to the rising concentration of CO2, also called carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. Now, all that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is actually what's causing climate change, but since this is something that we have to deal with, the fact that we have all this carbon in the atmosphere, I wanted to mention the fact that, oh, by the way, when these plants grow in this carbon dioxide-rich environment, it changes their nutrition level. So we'll have to eat more wheat to get the same amount of nutrition out of it in the future that we've been getting in the past. So some of the ways, foods that is being threatened are rice, wheat, and soybeans. A specific example is, in particular, for some crops, the zinc, the iron, the copper, the magnesium, and the calcium, all important nutrients for humans, decrease by 5 to 10% as the level of carbon dioxide rises.
Is that because the plants are just growing bigger?
Well, I don't know all the mechanics of it, but it is that the plant is spending its energy in different ways. So, next up is heat. So obviously heat definitely affects our food supply. And this is a quote from a professor at Stanford University. And he said, I think that there's an under-recognition of just how sensitive crops are to heat and how fast heat exposure is increasing. So to help you put that in terms that we can understand for those of us who are not farmers, here's a research study that shows that for every day during the growing season, when the temperatures go above 84 degrees Fahrenheit, corn yields drop by 0.7%. So when you think about that, 84 degrees Fahrenheit, we grow a lot of corn in Missouri. We've had a lot of days this summer over 84 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll look at a forecast later of how many days we can expect to be higher than that. And trust me, it's a lot. By end of the century, because of this, the forecasts are expected for corn yields in the U.S. to drop 1/3 just from heat stress alone, not from any of these other factors we're going to talk about, but from heat stress. Here's another study done by Kansas State University. This one looks at wheat, which, as you know, is a very important crop for Kansas. A 1.8 Fahrenheit increase, which is, again, approximately 1 degree Celsius, so that's about what we've already seen on average around the world, in projected mean temperature was found to decrease wheat yields by 21%. And as this slide comes up, I want to say that the end-of-century forecasts that we're seeing in this presentation are not set in stone. We, as a global community, still have the opportunity to change these forecasts by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's what the Columbia Climate Action Plan is all about, is really helping us figure out how to lower our greenhouse gas emissions individually and as a community, and also how to adapt. So I want to make sure and leave you with a sense of hope that some of the things we see forecast are not yet, something that we can't undo. Now, most of the forecasts for mid-century are likely to happen because one of the things about greenhouse gases is that they stay in the atmosphere for a long time. So once the pollution is emitted from our car's tailpipe or from a coal-fired power plant, it can stay up there 100 years or more. So a lot of the pollution that we've already emitted will still be in the atmosphere in 2050. We're still going to have some of these climate change impacts I'm talking about. But if we stop polluting today, we could really make a difference for the second half of this century, like 2050 to 2100. So these forecasts for Missouri that show, that we might have an 85% reduction in crop yields for corn, soybean, and wheat. They don't have to come true, but it's something that, that we need to be thinking about. We need to think about the impact on the farming community. We need to think about the impact that we'll have on Colombia, and also on the individual people involved. So next, let's talk about pests. Anybody who's a gardener will know that Japanese beetles are certainly a pest this summer. This is another study that looks at the environment in which the plants grow. So again, this study particularly looks at a carbon-rich environment. And so in this study, they found, with looking at soybeans, that aphids and Japanese beetles are actually drawn to plants that are raised in an elevated CO2 environment. And to make it even worse, when they feed on plants that have been raised in that environment, they live longer and they lay more eggs, so that allows, more bugs. And then the higher CO2 environment also reduces the plant's ability to fight off pests. So it's like a multi-pronged offensive. And then another concern, at least it's a concern I have, is that the more we have pests, the more a lot of growers, the growers who don't use organic farming methods, will be using pesticides and fungicides to fight these pests. And so that introduces more chemicals into the human food chain, and so I think that's also something to be aware of. So another impact is toxins. We're only going to talk about one form of toxins tonight. There's multiple forms that can impact our food, but I wanted to specifically talk about algae blooms. Algae blooms can produce neurotoxins. Algae blooms can be in the ocean. They can also be in lakes. And there's been some problems in the past years with algae blooms in the Great Lakes actually affecting drinking water supplies. This particular example is of an algae bloom that occurred in 2015 off the entire west coast of the United States and Mexico. And it was so bad in terms of the high levels of neurotoxin that they had to shut down fishing and crabbing while the toxin levels were so high. And so, of course, this has not only an impact on our food supply, but it's a dramatic impact on the people who make their living through fishing and crabbing. And this was specifically attributed to warmer waters in the Pacific and the tropics. So this, again, is an impact of climate change that's making the oceans warmer. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit more about oceans and lakes. So one of the reasons that, even though the scientists have been telling us that global warming's been going on for a long time, that we haven't felt it so much on land is because 93% of that extra heat that's now trapped in our atmosphere is being absorbed by the oceans. And so that has somewhat insulated us on land until recently from feeling these effects. And so, of course, this is having a tremendous impact on the ocean, that it's absorbing all this extra heat. And one of the changes that it's making in the ocean is it's increasing the acidity level of the ocean. And this has a very disastrous effect on shellfish, because a more acid environment actually, forces their shells to break down or not form in the first place. And so the ocean pH has changed from 8.2 to 8.1. And he thinks, well, that doesn't sound like very much. But the pH scale is what they call a logarithmic scale. And so what that actually is a 25 to 30% change in the acidity of the ocean during this time period that it's been measured. And so that has a really big effect on fish and the marine life in general. Now this is a particular study. This statement about warmer waters affecting the fish catch will apply everywhere in the world where the waters get warmer. But this was a particular study done by the World Bank off of the Philippines, where they found by mid-century 2050 that the water off of the Philippines will be so much warmer that it will reduce the fish catch by 50%. And this is really important when you think about the fact that 3 billion people in the world rely primarily on both wild-caught and farm-raised fish for it to be their major source of protein. Now, that's not something that we in the United States do as much as people in other parts of the world. You know, we're very much more into chicken, beef, and pork. But other parts of the world, their primary food source for protein is fish and seafood. Another unfortunate statistic is that from 1970 to 2012, we have already lost over 49% of the population of marine vertebrates. For those of you who are fishermen, or if you just like salmon and trout, it's unfortunate to say that climate change is going to have a significant impact on these cold water species. And that's for a variety of reasons. The lack of snow isn't melting into the rivers where salmon, feed and spawn, and so that's impacting the water temperature. Of course, we already talked about the oceans being warmer. So all this is having an impact not only upon the river where they live, but their food supply, and the chance that they'll be able to migrate to waters where they can continue to exist. They may not be able to migrate. So trout, at least like right now in Colorado, to some extent they can move to higher elevations, but eventually, they're not going to be able to keep doing that. So what can you do? So, you're thinking global food supply, I don't have much impact on that. But you can have an impact here locally, because what we want to do as citizens of Columbia or Missouri is to support our local farmers. We want Missouri to have a good, robust food production environment so that we're not dependent on California, we're not dependent on Arizona, we're not dependent on salmon from the Northwest, that we have our own local food sources. So you want to support local farmers, and you can do that by buying directly from local farmers or by shopping at farmers markets. Another thing you can do is start your own fruit and vegetable garden, and this is something that I've been trying to do. I didn't know anything about gardening, so for the past couple of summers now, I've been trying. Each summer I plant one new vegetable, and it's actually been going pretty well. This last 2 summers I had enough surplus that I actually was able to take some to the food bank, and I do it organically, and so I know about those bugs. So I definitely recommend you try it. It's good for stress, as well as stress management, I should say, not to produce stress, but for stress management, as well as helping you be able to have lower your carbon footprint and have locally grown food. The other thing you can do is, if you eat seafood, to make sure you're eating sustainable seafood. The Monterey Bay Aquarium produces an app you can get on your phone that provides information on which foods are sustainable. And so that's a handy reference you can keep, so that if you're sitting in a restaurant looking at the menu, you can say, now which foods should I eat? You can look it up. Another important thing is to eliminate food waste. In the United States, we waste a tremendous amount of food, a lot of it before it even gets to the grocery store. But then once it does get to the grocery store, restaurants, schools, ourselves, we're all wasting. So that's something that we need to work on. And as I mentioned at the beginning, next month's seminar is going to be focused on eliminating food waste and what we as a community can do to improve that situation. And then the final thing is to conserve water, because water is critical to the production of our food. And so let's move on and talk a little bit more about water. So our next global system that we'll talk about is water. So globally, where does water use happen? Of course, we all are familiar with our own needs for water, for drinking, cooking, bathing, that type of thing. But really, domestic water use only accounts for 12% of global water use. The majority, as you can see, is for agriculture. And so this is why it's so important to the food supply that we have enough water. And water is going to be one of the really restricted, constrained resources of the future. And unfortunately, as the temperatures rise, so does our need for water. Whether it's people needing to drink more or to be cooler, crops getting thirstier, energy even requires water. And so this is one reason why it's really important that we get off coal-fired power plants and eventually nuclear energy, is because those both require water to produce energy, whereas solar and wind do not. So in addition to all the other benefits of solar and wind energy, the lack of the need to have water is a good benefit. Industry requires water, as do animals. Water scarcity already affects over 40% of the global population. And I'm sure that you have heard about some of the situations like Cape Town, South Africa was on a countdown to run out of water. Fortunately, they finally did get some rain, and so it's extended their date. But what you may not realize is that right here in Missouri, Cameron, Missouri has only 160 days of water supply. This was in Sunday's Tribune. So just yesterday, this was in the newspaper. The northern part of Missouri is in what's called a severe drought. We're in a drought here in Columbia as well, but it's not as bad as what they're experiencing in the northern part of the state. And so both Cameron and the county of Caldwell are starting to look at, the end of their water supply if they don't get rain. So the state is going to put in place emergency water pipelines to bring them water from some lakes that do have water so that they can replenish their reservoirs and water supplies for these two parts of our state. So we talked earlier about how the heat causes the water vapor to, go out of the ocean and into the atmosphere, and that it holds more water vapor the warmer it gets. Well, that same extra heat that evaporates the water from the ocean pulls moisture even more quickly from the soil. And I should say that if you have a question, it's okay to interrupt me. I kind of get on a roll, but I'll be happy to take questions. Yes, Sally.
So I'm assuming, I've been gone a lot this summer, but I'm assuming you said we're in a drought condition in Columbia. Are you aware of any policies that the city's put in place to encourage less water use?
Not yet. I don't think it's gotten to the threshold where the city policies kick in. The only thing I've seen is they asked some of the subdivisions that have a lot of in-yard sprinkler systems to, alternate days so that would control the water pressure. Yes.
The plans for next year's water rates are designed to reduce the amount going into lawn irrigation.
Oh, okay.
Reduce the amount of what?
He said the plan for next year's rates for water will encourage reduced amounts going into lawn irrigation. So that's good. And there's a lot of things that you can do to tweak city policies like that through rates to provide incentives for people to use less water. So this visual is another one of those kind of scary visuals. Okay, so soil moisture is obviously really essential for growing agriculture crops. This is, again, a forecast for the end of the century. The brown shows you the areas that are going to have significantly less soil moisture. At the end of the century, they did during the 20th average of the last century, the 20th century. And so you can see Missouri is, not too bad. I mean, it's a lighter brown, so that's good news for us. Really bad news, though, for the states to our west and southwest. So, and then I'd also like to point you to look at Canada. I think, my personal opinion is we need to stay really good friends with our neighbors in Canada because a lot of our food crops are going to be moving there. Some of them already are, and some of us may want to live there. So, it's just good news that I just think we should stay friends with Canada.
Huh.
That land becomes more moist. I think a lot of global warming, though, wouldn't cause that.
I'm sorry, what was your
Wouldn't a lot of the global warming cause more soil up in Canada to have a lot more moisture because of the, not being frozen as much, the higher temperatures getting the soil,
Well, there is going to be a significant change, particularly up in the areas where they've had tundra.
Yeah.
Because the warmer temperatures are allowing the tundra
Permafrost and,
to thaw, which has its whole other implications in the whole global warming cycle. So I don't know exactly how that would affect the soil moisture, other than it shows on the map that even that will have reduced soil moisture content by the end of the century. So there's a lot of decades here for that to play out. Okay, so next we're going to focus in more specifically on some what they call global health, and so. We'll go back to that original bubble and we'll look at infectious diseases. And unfortunately, climate change is disrupting our natural ecosystems in a way that's making it better for infectious diseases. This is a quote from Andrew Dobson at Princeton University. And what he means by that is that the changes in rainfall patterns and the warmer conditions are all making it a more welcoming, hospitable environment for some of these infections and diseases. So this graphic shows you how tropical diseases are on the move from the tropics around the world. And part of this is caused by our global transportation system. A lot of goods and people are moving around the world all the time, and that's giving these bugs an opportunity to hitch a ride to other parts of the world where they might not have lived before. But because of climate change, once they get there, they're finding a nice environment to live in. So they find a good place where they can continue to flourish and reproduce and spread. There's a lot of different vectors that carry these emerging infectious diseases. The ones we're most familiar with here in Missouri are probably ticks and mosquitoes, but there's a lot of other ones that we could potentially be exposed to, like rodents and fleas and bats and algae. So we'll talk first about ticks. So this says, moose are under threat because, and it's making the point particularly because the ticks are expanding their range. And so, for example, like Canada is having to deal with ticks now that they've never had to deal with in the past. Now, we in Missouri have had to deal with ticks for a long time.
But it's getting worse.
It's getting worse, and the reason it's getting worse is because of the warmer winters. And that's because the winters are warm. It doesn't cause the ticks to die off in the wintertime. So you're still at risk for a longer period of time. If you want to go hiking in December now, you might still have to worry about ticks being alive. And the other thing is if they're living through the winter, then that just means even more ticks to reproduce come the next warm season. So significant ramifications for ticks. So in Missouri, we have several different forms of tick-borne illnesses that are present here. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, ehrlichiosis, let's see if I can say it right, anaplasmosis, and there's also, debate about Lyme disease. Some people say Lyme disease is here. Some people say it's a Lyme-like disease. There's actually 300 types of the bacteria family that cause Lyme disease. And so it's very possible that we have one here that's one of those 300 types, but isn't the exact same one that they originally had in Lyme, Connecticut. And this list of things, what to know about tick-borne diseases and infections, is actually from my own experience. Most of the things that I've put in here tonight are based in, you're shaking your head, but most of the things
It's more like a 2-week incubation.
well, I actually just saw a new one that was 3. I did have 2, and I changed the slide to 3 because I saw one that was now 3. So I always used to say 2 weeks until I just read this thing and I changed it to 3. I've had Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So this is something I speak from experience that you want to pay attention if you get a tick bite. And what I recommend to people is you put it on your calendar. On this date I got bit by a tick. If you don't always know because some of them are so small you don't even realize that they were on you and you might scratch it off and never be aware. But if you know you got bit by a tick, record it on the calendar. And then, as Alice says, most of the incubation periods are within 2 weeks. I did see a new one now that's 3 weeks. And they're still discovering new tick-borne diseases, unfortunately, pretty regularly. You may have heard of the Borne virus, that's a new one. So you need to pay attention to the next 3 weeks after you've had a tick bite. And the symptoms can vary because there's so many different possible infections you can get from a tick. It's important to know, though, that not all ticks carry disease. So, I've been bit by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ticks because I've grown up in Missouri all my life, hung out at the Lake of the Ozarks in the woods as a kid. And I've had 2 diseases, but I actually got both of those as adults, so not every tick has disease. So some of the symptoms to watch out for are high or low fevers, joint pain, stiff necks, muscle. You can have intestinal upset. Sometimes you say, well, I feel like I have the flu, but it's the summertime, and so you probably don't really have the flu, it's something else. And so the point I want to make is that a lot of times you can think that, well, I just got something else. But if you were bit by a tick and you get these symptoms, you need to go to the doctor and you need to say, I was bit by a tick, and insist on tick panel testing. So, I'm not a doctor, but it's my personal experience that I'm sharing with you. So it's important that you get treated quickly, because a lot of these diseases, if you're treated quickly, they can be completely cured. If you don't get treated quickly, then you may have long-lasting impacts from them. So, and some of them are life-threatening. Like there's a form of Rocky Mountain spotted fever that is life-threatening, and there's actually a form that's not. Fortunately, I had the not kind. But there is the life-threatening kind, and you need to get emergency treatment. Okay. So mosquitoes. So we have an ongoing problem with mosquitoes in Missouri, but fortunately most of them don't carry diseases. We've had experiences with West Nile virus, and that's something that is still being monitored for. But this mosquito, called the Aedes aegypti mosquito, that can carry the Zika virus, it was on the news a lot during the Zika outbreak. It can also carry yellow fever, and it can carry dengue fever. This is its estimated range. Now, Missouri does routine testing to try and trap mosquitoes and see what kind we're getting. And at least, I don't know about this summer, but last summer, they did not find any of this mosquito. So it is something to be aware of that, this mosquito could potentially be in Missouri, and it could potentially, be carrying those diseases. Now, one thing that kind of insulates us is that we don't have an outbreak of dengue fever, for example. So the mosquitoes can't be biting people who have dengue fever and then turn around and bite you. And so that's what happens. If somebody gets it and the mosquitoes start biting them, then it starts spreading. And so one of the things that kind of protects us is even though we may have the mosquitoes here, they're not biting people with dengue fever or yellow fever or Zika virus. So, but how does the climate affect the mosquitoes, which therefore affects their ability to carry and transmit this disease? So obviously with a warmer climate and a perhaps damper climate, the mosquitoes can expand their range. And also with the warmer season, you have more days that are warmer, summer and spring and all are lasting longer. So you have more warm days when mosquitoes are active. But then the mosquitoes, interestingly enough, their reproduction rate increases in a warmer environment. So you get more generations of mosquitoes that are available and are being born each year. And their metabolism accelerates, which causes them to want to bite us more. And then another factor is that the virus can incubate in the mosquito even faster in this warm environment, which allows more time, if they are infected, to transmit it to other hosts. So a lot of significant impacts from climate change on mosquitoes. So climate change also will increase the risk of many waterborne infectious diseases. Part of that is because of warmer conditions, and then part of that will be because of more flooding conditions. The one that we're most familiar with here in the United States is probably E. coli. And this is a statement from the EPA that just is validating the fact that when we have runoff and flooding, it can result from the increased extreme precipitation events that I talked about earlier. That it's very likely that it's going to contaminate our water sources. And this is a picture from, I believe it's Nebraska. And the fact here is that 2/3 of the waterborne disease outbreaks in the United States occur after extreme precipitation events. And this is one of the things that I paid attention to with Hurricane Harvey, since they had so much extreme precipitation there. Did they have any outbreaks of some of these diseases? And they did. They actually did have people coming in that were experiencing some of these type of diseases. So what is our defense against this? Well, one, of course, is awareness. Two is to make sure that we maintain our health infrastructure. And so really, the fact that some of our rural hospitals are closing is exactly the wrong thing to be happening. I mean, it's the wrong thing anyway for the people that live in those areas, but it's really wrong when you view it in light of climate change, because we're going to have an increased demand for public health facilities like hospitals instead of less demand. So this is something that the way that we need to do this is really to make sure that we're strengthening our health infrastructure, not allowing it to decrease. Okay, next we're going to talk about heat stress, which is something that we're already quite familiar with, unfortunately, here in Missouri. But I do want to just bring out a couple of points. Climate change has already made extremely hot days 4 to 5 times more common. A couple of statistics from here in the Midwest. So annual temperatures in the Midwest are now 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average than they have been in the past. And the coldest day of the year is now 2.9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer compared to the 1900 to 1950 time frame. Although that doesn't sound a lot, but when you think about it being on average, so any given day, that's not so much, but when you talk about raising your averages, that is a significant trend. And in Columbia, winters and springs have already had the most warming, and I think those of us who live there have lived here probably experienced that. And we've been having fewer cold waves since the mid-1980s. And another thing that's impacting us and is very important to this discussion of human health is that the nights are getting warmer. So it used to be even if you had a hot day, the night would cool off and you could get some relief and your body could get some relief and cool down if you didn't have air conditioning. Well, that is changing, and the nights are now staying in the 80s. So, you go outside at 10 o'clock at night, it's still, like 85 degrees. So that is a big change and is something that people need to be aware of. And then another thing that most people don't realize, I certainly didn't before I started working in this area, is that extreme heat causes more deaths annually in the U.S. than any other kind of extreme weather event combined. Even in the United States, every time we have a heat wave, mortality goes up 4%. So that is not because we don't have the resources to care for it. It's lack of awareness on all of our parts of the impact of heat upon our bodies. So, as I said earlier, all people, whether you're young or old, are vulnerable to heat. If you are a young person and you go out and you overdo it on a really hot, humid day, you're going to be susceptible to heat exhaustion or heat stroke. But there are people who are more vulnerable, and so you need to be aware. It's going to be the poor because they possibly don't have air conditioning. The elderly, because once you pass 70, your body's ability to regulate its temperature diminishes somewhat. Infants and children, infants particularly because their regulation of their climate or their temperature of their body hasn't really developed yet. And then those with pre-existing medical conditions are particularly at risk, especially people with cardiac and respiratory problems. So this is something to be aware of. If you've got these kind of situations, you don't just go out and try to mow the lawn when it's 95 degrees outside. Another category is the mentally ill. And part of the reason mentally ill is on here is, one, they may not be aware enough to be able to deal with taking care of themselves in a heat environment, but also many of them take prescription drugs. And a lot of regular people that aren't mentally ill take prescription drugs. And prescription drugs can significantly impact your body's ability to regulate its temperature. So that's something that, like for me, that's something I have to be aware of. And I think that it does impact my ability. And so I have to pay attention to if I'm getting hot. Now, this is another one of those, forecasts, and it's all just, repeat that the ones for the end of the century don't have to come true if we all work together to keep them from happening. So this is a forecast from the Risky Business Report that shows how many days of over 95 degrees temperatures could be expected in St. Louis. I have a similar chart for Kansas City, so I figured, we're right in the middle, so we're about the same. They're very similar, the two charts. So over the last 30 years, on average, we had about 8 days of temperature days over 95 degrees. By mid-century, we can expect that to increase to 35 degrees. By the end of the century, if we don't get our act together and stop polluting the atmosphere, we can expect over 126 days a year of temperatures over 95 degrees. Now, that's 4 months. So I think our bodies are going to have a really hard time coping with that. And you can imagine all the implications for people who work outside, who don't have air conditioning. I think everybody will have to have air conditioning by then. It will just be mandatory. So, or people will move underground. I don't know what. And that it's really important to familiarize yourself with the symptoms of both heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And I would also encourage anyone who has children or grandchildren that are still college age and younger to make sure that they're aware of these and that they know to speak up for themselves. Unfortunately, almost every year we hear of some young man dying as a result of heat stroke because of football training. And, a lot of football people are getting smarter, but, we need to teach our young people that they need to speak up for themselves if they start experiencing any of these kind of symptoms. And I mean not whining just because it's hot outside. I mean, I know my grandsons do that. I mean, really understanding the difference between I'm just hot because I'm sweating, or I'm too hot, I have to take a break, I have to cool down, I have to get something to drink. And so with heat stroke, as it says here, the hallmark symptom is your body temperature is over 104 degrees. But most of the time, we don't run around with thermometers. And so it's important that if people, are having these kind of symptoms where, they become unstable on their feet or they're fainting, that you recognize that this could be heat stroke. And heat stroke is a life-threatening situation, and you need to get emergency medical help immediately, and you need to take action to start cooling off the individual. And I also mentioned that dogs can have both heat stroke and heat exhaustion. So, because as a pet owner, I had a dog that experienced this. So when I lived in Texas. So something to be aware of and something to teach our children so that they can speak up for themselves if they're in an environment where they need to take precautions. Allergens. Now this doesn't seem like a real crisis one, but if you suffer from allergies, it can be important. So I'd like to encourage anybody to start getting treatment if you haven't already, because when you see how bad it's going to get by 2040, you will know that you want to probably do something about it, not just try and power through. I personally have allergies, and I've gotten allergy shots, and for me they did a world of good, but I will tell you that they take a few years to really start working. And so you can see here in 2000 they observed about 8,455 grains of pollen per cubic meter. And by mid-century, around 2040, that's expected to go up to over 21,000 grains of pollen per cubic meter. So if you have allergies, then this is something that sounds like a really bad impact. Another thing, if you're allergic to poison ivy, and this is one of these changes that's already with us and is expected to get worse, poison ivy is becoming poisonier. That's probably not the right word. The toxic oil in the plant is increasing. You can see how much it's increased from 1950 to today, and how much it's expected to increase over the coming years. So stay away from poison ivy. All right, next up we're going to talk about mental health. So mental health there's a lot of implications about mental health related to the changing climate. There's obviously the direct impacts that climate change has, like producing extreme weather events, weather disasters, and this has significant impacts on people because of, and it's also before the event, during the event, after the event. Before the event, you're worried, is this going to, destroy my home? Am I going to die, depending on what the event is. After the event or during the event, you're anxious because maybe you have been evacuated, but you don't know what's happening. And then after the event, maybe your home was destroyed or your place of business was destroyed, and you have all of these ramifications to your life. And so significant mental health distress before, during, and after any kind of extreme weather events. And we're seeing a lot of this with people. They actually develop, like people from Hurricane Harvey. Some of them have post-traumatic stress disorder. I know my great nieces went through the tornado in Joplin. It took a few years before they could, not get all anxious if there was just a thunderstorm. So, this is definitely a real impact. The second way that it affects our mental health is not just those actual events when they're happening, but then the disruption it makes to our social environment, to our networks, to our jobs. A lot of people, like for example, after Katrina had to move from New Orleans, they relocated to Houston and other places. They lost all their social networks. They lost their church maybe that they've been to forever. They lost their neighbors that were maybe their friends. And so all of these things have an impact on your mental health. And then finally, attending presentations like this, and the more you learn about climate change, sometimes the more anxiety it can produce. So I want to make sure and leave you with the idea that there are things that you can do. You can take actions. And the way to feel empowered is to take action. take action to get involved, reduce your own carbon footprint. There'll be a lot of opportunities in Columbia to be on commissions and boards to help implement the climate action plan. There'll be a lot of different things that you can do, and we've talked multiple times tonight about how climate change affects people in poverty. You can get involved to help people work their way out of poverty, and in that respect, you'll be helping people prepare for climate change. So there are so many things that you can do. So if you feel anxious about climate change, don't just sit back and feel anxious. Get involved and do something, whether it's to help the community be more resilient, or to help lower your own carbon footprint, or to try and get involved like I am in trying to educate people and drive political will for action. Yes?
I was going to say yes, and vote for people who understand that climate change is real.
Yes, exactly. We have an election coming up, and we have an opportunity to vote for people who will take action on climate change. So I hope that you all will, consider that as one of the factors in which candidates you choose. And then one of the interesting things is I lived down in Carthage, Missouri when Joplin had their big tornado in 2011. And it was one of the deadliest tornadoes in U.S. history. And if any of you were in Missouri at the time, you probably heard a lot on the news about it. It was quite devastating. But one of the interesting things about it was that everybody was looking for something to do, and so our Carthage community was not physically damaged by the tornado, because fortunately it lifted up before it got there. But we wanted to help, and so our church community said, well, what can we do to help? And so, and a lot of churches, were a mainstay of really bringing the community together, and there was a lot of churches that were meeting immediate needs for food and shelter and clothing and, baby products. But our church, one of the things that was pointed out to us was that with every big disaster comes an increase in domestic violence. And so our church ended up getting together funding to build a second shelter for abused women and children so that they would be able to escape their abusive situation. And this happens over and over and over again after any kind of an extreme disaster event. That the stress and that it puts on relationships and family, because people have lost jobs, because they've lost their home, because they've lost so many things, that the violence against women and children significantly increases. So this is something that is one of the factors that we as a community need to prepare for and understand, that if we are unfortunate enough to have a disaster here, that this is something that's going to likely be an outcome. And there's also been a lot of studies in the last couple of months too that are showing that just violence in general increases when it's hot outside. Yeah. So that's something else that we have to take into account as we're planning for resources going forward. Air pollution. Air pollution is another thing that can significantly impact our health, and unfortunately climate change can make air pollution worse. Worldwide, air pollution today kills 6.5 million people a year. Now, in the United States, we don't necessarily think about air pollution so much because thanks to the Clean Air Act, which was passed a few decades back, we actually have fairly decent air in a lot of our communities, but not all. There's a lot of communities that still have poor air quality. So the mortality from air pollution costs the United States nearly 4% of its annual gross domestic product. So this is another example of, people say it costs too much to convert to clean energy. It costs too much for our society to get off fossil fuels. Well, if they would just look at the facts, burning fossil fuels is costing our society significantly. I mean, 4% of GDP is significant. Over the past several years, our economy hasn't even grown by 4% a year. So this is a significant amount, and if we could shift that result of air pollution into more productive resources, it would be much better for the people and our economy. So one of the ways that air pollution is worse from climate change is ground level ozone. Now, those of you who are old enough will probably remember when you had a hole in the ozone layer and the world had to get together and take corrective action to fix that problem, and thank goodness they did. And that's part of the reason why we have to wear sunscreen so much today, is because the hole isn't completely repaired. So ozone way up high in the atmosphere is good. Ozone at ground level is bad. It can actually, if you inhale it, it actually causes like a sunburn on your lungs. And so you don't want ground level ozone. It's an invisible pollutant, you can't see it. It negatively impacts both our respiratory and our cardiovascular system. It is most impactful on children with asthma, adults with respiratory and heart conditions, and people who work outdoors, because of course they're more exposed to it. And you might think that this is only a big city problem. And if you've driven through St. Louis in the summer, you might see those flashing signs on the highway that say, you know, ozone alert, orange day, something like that. And it is definitely a big city problem. The precursors for ozone, a lot of them come from our automobiles, but they can also come from other industrial sources. And the way this relates to climate change is that ozone is produced on warm, sunny days. So when the precursors are present in the atmosphere. So as we have more warm, sunny days, we're going to have more ozone. And this isn't just a big city problem for a couple of reasons. One is ozone can be blown by the prevailing winds. So since Kansas City is west of us, Kansas City's ozone can be blown through our county, for example. And then the other thing is that in the 2015 report from the American Lung Association State of the Air report, there were 14 counties in Missouri that had a D or an F grade on that report for ozone pollution. And this isn't just a big city problem, because if you have a coal-fired power plant in your county, this can be one of the results. So fortunately, the city has stopped burning coal, and we still have in New running a small amount of coal, so hopefully they will stop. And then one of the other problems is a lot of counties don't even have air quality monitors, so we don't even really know what's going on in those counties. Now another way that climate change can affect air pollution is with particulate matter, also called soot. And fires lead to an increase in particulate matter, and they also lead to the presence of ozone precursors in the atmosphere. And so if you have people that are living in the area where they're currently experiencing all the smoke and soot from wildfires, make sure that they're taking precautions to protect themselves, and particularly their children. Children should be wearing masks if they go outside in those environments, and you'll see on a later slide how important it is for children not to be exposed to particulate matter. And the reason is because, one of the reasons is because children, they breathe more air per unit of body weight than we do as adults. And so they experience a greater proportionate exposure when they're exposed to air pollution. So that's why it's really important to make sure children are being protected from air pollution. And there was a study done in Sweden where they studied 500,000 young people under the age of 18 to try and determine what impact pollution actually has on both mental health and cognitive ability. And as a result of this study, they determined that they actually can have a negative impact on both mental health and cognitive ability. What they studied was nitrous dioxide, which is NO2 for short. And that led to a 9% increase in mental illness in children. And then, let me see if I can scroll down. Whoops, I can't find my cursor to scroll down. But there was also a similar increase in children's mental health and cognitive negative impacts for particulate matter, which is called PM 2.5, which is what is frequently produced by wildfires. Now in Colombia, as part of the work that I'm doing with the task force, I actually went and met with the fire chief to talk about what our fire risk is from climate change. And so we used 2012 as an example, and because 2012, if you remember, was the year we had extreme drought and very warm summer as well. And so he said, that Colombia did experience an increase in brush fires and grass fires and backyard fires. That we don't really have so much of a problem, even though we have some urban forests. We don't have so much of a problem with that because most of our urban forests are very visible from people driving by or people who live nearby. And so if smoke starts coming up, people can see right away that there's a problem and call the fire department, and they can get there before it turns into a raging wildfire. But brush and grass fires are a problem, and then when it's really dry out, people don't realize how dry their backyard is, how dry their deck might be, and so they have a much greater incidence of those kind of fires in Colombia. So we do have a greater fire risk here, but fortunately, it doesn't, look like, at least in the near term, we'll be dealing with anything like California has to deal with. Now, I put this slide in. This is also about air pollution. Because one of the great things about fighting climate change with clean energy is it produces the co-benefit of reducing air pollution. The more we get rid of coal-fired power plants or other kinds of fossil fuel and we shift to clean energy, the better we improve the quality of our air. And so Harvard, Boston, and Syracuse universities did a study to try and determine, well, what are the co-benefits of actually implementing a plan like the Clean Power Plan that was proposed by the Obama administration. And so they found that if the United States had implemented that plan, and we've actually gotten some of the benefits of that plan, even though it was officially never implemented because utilities thought it was going to be implemented, so they've started converting to clean energy, but not the kind of benefits we could have gotten if we'd gone full-blown implementation. But just as an example, if we had implemented the Clean Power Plan in 2020, compared to just going along business as usual, not making any changes, it would have saved 3,500 lives per year, prevented 1,000 hospitalizations, and prevented 220 heart attacks. Now, the reason that I wanted to mention this is because just this past week in the news, and most of you are probably aware that the current administration has tried to put a stop to the Clean Power Plan. And they just came out this week with their new proposed power plan, which would allow and basically encourage communities and states to continue burning coal and other fossil fuels. And so even the EPA under this administration has estimated that this new plan would result in 470 to 1,400 premature deaths each year by 2030. So we have a choice as a society to convert to clean energy and eliminate air pollution, which is causing all of these side effects, or we cannot. So choice is yours. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about that kind of security. And so they had terrible fires, and unfortunately, it resulted in over 55,000 people dying. And so that was the impact directly for Russia. But unfortunately, this also caused a problem with that led to instability in other countries around the world, because 4 months later, both Russia and Ukraine, because of the drought and the wildfires, had to halt grain exports. And at that point in time, Russia was exporting grain to other countries. But in order to have enough food for their own population, they had to stop exports. And so this caused a price spike in worldwide food prices. And there's two price spikes on here. One is from the Russia event, and then another one is when 2012, when the United States had significant drought and had lower production as well. And so food, in the United States, again, we're a wealthy society. We can be, some of us can be somewhat insulated from food price spikes, not all of us, of course. But in some countries, the majority of their income goes to their daily food. And so this is an example of a food protest in Pakistan in 2008. Now, Syria is an example of how climate change can be a contributor to unrest. So back before the civil war started in Syria, they were having a significant drought. And this is an example of a farmer saying, he used to have 400 acres of wheat, but then it all turned into desert. And in 2006 to 2010, over 60% of Syria's fertile land turned back into desert because of this drought. And so you can imagine how many people that displaced, people who made their living and lived on those in that farming environment. So the estimate is that this pushed 1.5 million people into Syria's cities, people that now had no means of income. And this is a cable that was obtained via WikiLeaks, which says the Syrian Minister of Agriculture stated publicly that economic and social fallout from the drought was beyond our capacity as a country to deal with. And so this is an example of how it was a precipitating factor. Now, obviously, there was other problems in Syria with disagreements over how the government operated, But this was a precipitating factor when you have 1.5 million people who are displaced and in the city with nothing better to do than to, start protesting the situation. And of course, that civil war continues to this day. That drought was considered one of the worst ever measured in the region. And the forecast is that parts of the Middle East are going to become, Middle East and North Africa will be uninhabitable in the future. And that's going to cause a lot of people the pressure to migrate. And just to give you a specific concrete example of the kind of heat we're talking about, of course this was just a one-day event in 2015, but since then recorded temperatures have also been recorded, at least similar temperatures have been recorded in other countries around the world. This is a heat index from Iran, was 165 degrees Fahrenheit on July 31st of 2015. 165 degrees. I find it miserable when it's over 100 here, so.
Do you know what the actual temperature was?
No, I don't. I just know the heat index. So what regions are most at risk of being uninhabitable due to this combination of heat and humidity? The Persian Gulf, northern India, and eastern China. And if you know very much about geography, you know those are all very populous areas of the world. So we can anticipate significant shifts in human population occurring as we go through the next several decades. This comes from the U.S. Department of Defense. And so, at this point in time, with the position that the administration is taking, they're actually at odds with the position that the Department of Defense took in 2014 and continues to take to this day, that climate change is a significant risk for the United States. And their statement is that climate change will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions across the globe. The Department of Defense thinks climate change is a great risk, and that is something that we need to be addressing. And I haven't talked about sea level rise, because that's not an impact that will, hopefully directly affect us here in Missouri. But it will affect us from a migration perspective, and possibly from an economic perspective. This graph shows the top 10 cities at risk for sea level rise into 2070. And you can see that Miami is down over here on the right side of the screen is the one U.S. city. This is based upon population. Now, if you look at it by assets, because our cities are so built up along the eastern seaboard, we get two on here now. We get Miami and New York, Newark. And one of the ways that this can affect us in terms of fallout is you can imagine all the real estate loans that are in place on all that infrastructure in the city of Miami and the city of New York, Newark, and how that will impact us if those properties become, destroyed because they can't be inhabited any longer due to sea level rise. So there's a risk of economic fallout, but there's also, of course, a risk of to the people who live there and their requirement to migrate. So, as we all know, the world has had a hard time dealing with the number of refugees that came from Syria, which was around 6 million. If you add up the people that live in those top 10 cities by population, it's 80 million refugees. So that's just the top 10 largest cities. It doesn't include all the other cities that are, scattered along those coastal areas. So how is the world going to deal with 80 million refugees? And so that's something that we need to think about, and it's something that we need to prepare for, because there's going to be people from our own country who are going to need to be moving. And there's already some relocations in Alaska and Louisiana from people who live along the coast. It's already happening. So the cost of carbon is very high, and this is, from fossil fuel production. We've covered a lot of these tonight, and so this is just kind of a recap about all of the costs, and so many times the cost of the carbon pollution is not factored in to the prices that we pay, and it's something that going forward is something that needs to change. So normally at this point in the presentation, I talk a little bit about the solutions, because But this has been an ongoing series, and we spent the first couple of seminars talking about solutions, so I'm hoping at this point that you're not all really depressed. But I do want to leave you with just one slide to show you something optimistic that's happening. We do have the solutions. We know how to fight this problem. We know how to get off of fossil fuels. We just have to develop the resolve to do it and make the changes that are necessary. And the United States, a lot of times you hear people talk about China being the largest polluter of greenhouse gas emissions. And yes, they surpassed us on a total basis. But on a per capita basis, the United States is still the biggest greenhouse gas polluter in the world. Each of us is responsible for significant greenhouse gas emissions because of our American lifestyle. And that makes the United States still number 2 in the world for greenhouse gas emissions. And when you think about how many products in China are produced for the benefit of the United States, I suspect if you added that in, we still might be number 1. So we have a lot to do to make up for our past and our current sins, our current pollution. So the United States is in the process of making this conversion. It doesn't make the news every day, but if you look at new electricity capacity that was added in the United States in 2017, so this isn't all electricity capacity, this is just new. And we add new all the time because of growth in the economy and the population, as well as the fact that some plants are getting old and are retired because they're just old. So new capacity that's coming online, 62% of it last year was either solar or wind. And so that is good. It shows us that we're converting. We also had a lot come online that was still natural gas. Natural gas is a fossil fuel, and so we still do need to be getting rid of that, but at least it is less impactful from a greenhouse gas perspective than coal is. So we need to be getting this picture to be even more of the clean, renewable picture, but at least we're making good progress. Okay, so now I wanted to just shift gears for a minute and talk about the climate action plan work that we have going on here in Columbia. So I am a member of the task force. There's a couple other members here in the room tonight as well. And we originally started this climate series, the nonprofits that are sponsoring it, to really support the community and the task force as we go through this process. Where we are right now is in the phase of developing strategies and goals and actions.
Is there a way to make that bigger?
Oh,
I guess not.
not really, don't think so. Let me see.
You can find it online.
Okay.
Yeah, it is online, so let me just point that out. Oops, no, that didn't work. Right. Okay, so this URL up here, como.gov/sustainability/climate action, you can find all this information, and I would encourage you to go there and sign up to get updated on the progress of the climate plan, as well as opportunities for public input. So where we are right now, as I said, is we're in the stage of evaluating and prioritizing strategies and actions to deal with the risk and the threats that we've identified. So we did that first. We identified the threats to our community and the areas where we needed to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from electricity generation or from our transportation, our 2 biggest sources that we have here in Columbia. And so we're looking at strategies, and we'll be meeting over the next month or 2 to prioritize those and develop actions. There'll be an opportunity for public input, and I'll tell you about the workshop coming up on the next slide. But there are multiple opportunities for public input, and then ultimately the goal is to have a final plan to present to the City Council in May of 2019, and then hopefully they will accept a plan by June of next year. Good news is that the City Council just a week ago did unanimously approve the greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals that the task force recommended, and that we set some interim goals for 2035 and then goals for 2050 and 2060. And so basically by 2050, city operations would be carbon neutral. We will reduce emissions by 100%, hopefully. And then by 2060, the whole community will be hopefully carbon neutral. So we have a lot of changing to do.